Hey, good morning. Thank you for making some time. So I'm going to keep this short initially because I want to give some time for questions at the end. What I want to start, the basic question that I want to ask is, oftentimes we're assessing kids' EF on a single testing occasion. And the question is, what do we get from that? Is that a reasonable sort of approach for assessing EF? And that's sort of a standard in the field. And I'm just doing some new thinking about what are we getting from that? And are we getting what we hope we're getting from that? So before I start, I just want to sort of orient everyone to when I'm talking about executive function skills, what am I talking about? These are domain general cognitive processes, which just means they're cognitive processes that we use for a lot of different purposes. They facilitate learning, they facilitate goal-directed behavior. Anytime you're engaging in some activity where you can't sort of be on autopilot, the executive function skills are getting engaged. And in early childhood, inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility are sort of the three domains of EF, if you will. So inhibitory control refers to ability to override a habit or override some strongly learned association. Working memory is the ability to hold information in mind, often in the face of distraction. And then cognitive flexibility is the ability to sort of shift attention or shift your attentional perspective. And all of these skills are rapidly changing in young children. So if you've been around 3, 4, 5-year-olds, you see really marked changes in their way that they can control their behavior, control their movement, control their thinking. And we think that executive function skills are contributing to those sort of emerging capabilities in little kids. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of interest in this because EF contributes to school readiness. So as kids are transitioning into formal schooling, there's new expectations being made of them, and the ability for them to use EF skills to sort of navigate the social world and the sort of increasingly academic world of kindergarten or first grade sort of serves them well. We are often using EF as an indicator of neurodevelopment. That's the way this has been framed in the studies I'm helping out here. And it's important to realize that EF skills are malleable. So don't think about these as sort of under tight genetic control that are sort of maturational. Kids' early life experience is shaping neural circuits that are facilitating EF skills. And we can talk about interventions later. And from an assessment perspective, performance-based assessments are the gold standard. So there are other ways people are trying to get at executive function skills. There are increasingly questionnaire measures of EF. They're not a gold standard. There's a lot of interesting conversation about what they're getting. But we're going to focus on performance-based tasks, which is where most of my work has been done. And what we're really doing is we're using tasks that come out of an adult neuropsychology literature. So a lot of the paradigms that we use for these quote unquote games that we're presenting to kids really are using paradigms that we know rely on in some way prefrontal activity or prefrontal circuits. And we've, over the last 25 years, people have taken these paradigms and sort of framed them in sort of game-like experiences that you can use with 3, 4, 5-year-olds. And what we typically do, and the studies I'm supporting here, we'll administer a battery of these games or a battery of these tasks on a single testing day, right? And we're going to score kids' performance. And what we're hoping is that kids who are performing better on these tasks are sort of farther along in terms of their cognitive development, or we might say they have sort of more efficient prefrontal circuitry. But what we're often doing is suggesting that how you did today represents something endogenous, right? Not that it's immutable, but it's something that you're bringing to every occasion. And so what I want to do today is just sort of interrogate that a little bit and get a sense of, is that a reasonable assumption? Or how reasonable an assumption is it? So one of the questions then is, well, what evidence do we have that when we administer kids, tasks to kids, that these are sort of going to be indicative of what I'll call trait-like variance? And although the paradigms come out of this sort of tradition of looking at sort of neuroimaging studies or electrophysiology studies, those studies are difficult to do with young children. So oftentimes people lean into the idea of test-retest reliability and say, hey, these tests, we administered them on 2 different occasions. By and large, kids who perform well on one day tend to do well on the next day. There's some evidence that there's some stability in their performance. And that's often used as evidence that we're getting at something that's sort of foundational to kids or endogenous. But when you poke in the test-retest reliability literature in EF, you'll start to see some problems. So for a long time, people have questioned the variability in results that you often see. This is in the adult literature and in young kids. So oftentimes when we do retest reliability studies with, in my case, preschoolers, we see pretty modest performance. So on the left side of the panel there are tables from 2 of the studies that we've published on this. And the punchline is, on average, you administer tasks to kids on 2 different occasions over maybe a 2 to 4 week period, and you get correlations of between 0.5 and 0.7. So it's okay. It's not terribly strong, but it's okay. And people sort of hem and haw and say, well, some of them are better than others. One of the things that's interesting, though, is there's a recent paper by Rabiel and Congdon that sort of really provides a high level of really deep thought piece on reliability. And they make the point that when we do test-retest reliability studies, we're actually not able to disambiguate trait sources of variance from state sources of variance. In other words, we conflate those 2 things. So they make a distinction between dependability studies where you administer EF tasks, for example, in close succession, maybe across a 2-week period. And that's what I'm presenting on the left. Or you can sort of measure EF across a longer period of time, and they'll refer to that as the stability coefficient. But regardless of the span of time, the fact that some kids are tending to do better on both occasions doesn't necessarily mean that the tasks are measuring trait-like variance. And in fact, they make the case that you need 3 assessments of the same child in order to sort of tease these things apart. So that's what we're going to do in a few minutes. So the other thing I like to think about is, well, if tasks are not represented by traits, and if there are state or sort of situational influences on EF, what evidence do we have that that's true for little kids? So there's this great series of studies where they'll bring preschoolers into a lab and they'll randomly assign what cartoon kids are going to watch. And so in the left panel, this is a study by Angeline Lillard. They assign kids to watch cartoons for 11 minutes. Some kids are going to watch SpongeBob. Some kids are going to watch Arthur. Some kids are going to watch all kinds of different cartoons, 4 different cartoons. What's different about the cartoons is they differ in the pace at which the information is presented, and they differ in the extent to which they have high fantasy content. And what they show is that after 11 minutes of watching cartoons, if you've watched SpongeBob, your performance on the EF tasks is appreciably lower than if you watched a cartoon that wasn't fast-paced and didn't have high fantasy content. So just 11 minutes creates pretty sizable differences between kids. These are standardized mean differences of between 0.4 and 0.6. So pretty robust changes after a really short time. The right panel is a study that was done in China. They look at Tom and Jerry and Mickey Mouse as their 2 things. They do a language dub. They have kids watch for 18 minutes. At the end of 18 minutes, kids who've watched Tom and Jerry are performing appreciably less well on EF tasks. So I raise this because this is experimental data, and it suggests that small perturbations could be influencing how kids are performing. Right? So really interesting, but also a little alarming for those of us who are sitting down on a single occasion, because I don't know what you did before you came to the testing occasion. So this is often called the SpongeBob effect, because that's a replicated effect that Angeline Lillard has shown. And the media picked this up, watching SpongeBob makes you dumber. That was the sort of punchline. It doesn't make you dumber, but it undermines some attentional processes and really interferes with your ability to engage EF skills. And these are all preschool age kids. Then there's another set of studies that are sometimes referred to as the Batman effect studies. The basic gist here is that, again, you bring kids in to a lab and you randomly assign them. They're all going to complete, on the left panel, they're completing an executive function task. On the right panel, they're completing a vigilance task. And all we're going to do is we're going to randomly assign them to get slightly different instructions. So what's called the self-immersed condition tells kids, hey, you're about to play a game and it's pretty tricky or it's confusing. When you're doing this, I want you to ask yourself, where do I think this card should go in the card sorting task? Or am I working hard? So I'm referencing myself. A different group of kids are going to get the instruction that says, this is a tricky task. I want you to ask yourself, where do I think Mike should put the card? How hard is Mike working? So I'm referring to myself in the third person. And the idea is that they're creating some psychological distance. And then there's a third group of kids who get told, you're going to be Batman. And we want you to play this task as if you're Batman. And you get a Batman cape, and you get a Batman belt. And your instructions are, sometimes this is tricky. Ask yourself, where does Batman think the card should go? Or is Batman working hard? And if you look at the figures, what they've pointed out is that when you don't reference yourself, but you reference yourself in third person, or especially if you engage Batman, you do better on tasks than kids who didn't have that instruction. Now, it's also going to be clear that it's most evident with 5 and 6-year-old kids, because there's really an issue of theory of mind here. When we're asking kids to take on the persona of someone else, you have to have theory of mind skills in order to be able to do that. But I feature these 2 studies, and there's at least a third study that's replicated this, because here we're not spending 10 or 20 minutes of having you watch cartoons. We're literally just changing instructions. And I can, again, shift kids' performance around. So there's lots of reasons, I think, to believe there can be situational influences on how kids are doing on the EF tasks. So this leads us to latent state trait theory. And latent state trait theory is a conceptual and really a statistical approach for thinking about the consistency of behavior over time and thinking about ways of modeling information to understand how much of the, in our case, executive function performance is consistent across time. I'll call it trait-like, and how much of it is occasion-specific, sort of reflecting sort of situational influences. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the percentage of reliable variance in a task. So it's really a variance partitioning strategy. We're going to look at the measurement error in tasks, hold that aside, and then of the reliable variance, how much of that variance in task performance is trait-like, something that you bring every time you experience these tasks, versus situational. And I love this quote, and I think this is sort of a useful quote for you all to be thinking about as you're thinking about all of the work that you're doing. But there's this idea that when someone is assessed, they are in a situation. There's no situational vacuums. We're all bringing our mood, whether we're exhausted, whether we're alone, whether we're hungry, whether we're feeling ill. We're always bringing those things with us when we do an assessment. And the point is, this is inescapable. So although we spend a lot of time training data collectors and certifying them and making sure they're doing everything in a very systematic way, which we should be doing, we don't get to standardize the experience that kids walk into the room with, right? And so the question then becomes, how much of this is an issue? So this is sort of new thinking for me. I'm still trying to get myself hands around the literature. I can only find one study that's applied this sort of latent state trait theory methodology to executive function data. They were working with undergraduate students. We may talk about that a little bit later. What I'm going to do is just take advantage of a data set that I have where we happen to have measured kids 3 times and apply these methods. And we're going to look at consistency, which is the trait-like contribution to tasks, and then occasion-specific specificity, which is state-like. And then in addition to a couple of EF tasks, I'm also going to bring some comparison tasks. So a simple reaction time task and assessors' ratings of kids' attention, just to see how stable are they essentially. So I'll pause. Any questions here about what we're talking about? Because it's going to get a little bit more detailed here, and I want to make sure you at least understand conceptually what we're after. So the COWL study is something we completed recently where we were looking at executive function and motor skill development and physical activity. And we happened to assess kids 3 times, fall, winter, spring, across an academic year. We had about 281 kids who generated about 775 observations. It's a racially diverse sample by North Carolina standards, and is reasonably diverse in terms of half the families report having a 4-year college degree. And so we administer these executive function tasks, and here I'm going to focus on 3 inhibitory control tasks and 2 working memory tasks. Most of these are being used in the studies in the MIND project that we're supporting, not all of them, but most. And so in the animal go, no-go task, kids are basically being shown series of animals, and they're taught you're supposed to touch the green button every time you see an animal except when it's a pig. When it's a pig, you withhold the response. This is an old paradigm, a go, no-go paradigm. And as the number of animals you've touched increases, it gets more and more difficult to sort of withhold a response. So it's sort of motoric inhibitory control. We're interested in how they do on the pig trials. The other trials are just sort of a setup. In the silly sound Stroop, this is a classic Stroop task. We're taking advantage of the fact that kids have known sounds associated with animals. So in the silly sounds, they're told, hey, we know that dogs make barking sounds and cats make meowing sounds, but in the silly sounds game, when you hear the dog bark, you touch the cat. When you hear a cat meow, you touch the dog. So it's inhibitory control because you're inhibiting a strong sort of prepotent association. And then we have a spatial conflicts task that we call arrows. And here kids are shown, taught that there's 2 buttons and the arrow points either to the left or the right, and your job is to touch the button that the arrow is pointing to. Sometimes the arrows are congruent so that the spatial location of the arrow and the direction of the arrow are congruent. So kids are biased. When you see something in the left field, you're more inclined to touch the left button. And in congruent items, left pointing arrows are appearing above left buttons, and right pointing arrows are appearing above right buttons. In the incongruent condition, which is shown at the bottom, right pointing arrows start showing up above left buttons. The game is touch the button that the arrow is pointing to. So the correct response here is to touch the right button, even though the arrow is above the left side. So that's incongruent. There's spatial incompatibility, and kids' ability to do that is also an indicator of inhibitory control. And we also look at 2 working memory tasks. One is called pick the picture. Pick the picture, this is on the right side. We show them an array of pictures. Kids are instructed, touch a picture. Pictures show up in a different order. They touch another picture that you haven't touched before so that all the pictures get a turn. And you keep cycling through this sort of array of pictures, and kids are making responses. So in this example, they touch the sun first, then the screen advances, they touch the car. The car is a correct answer because they've touched the sun before, so as long as they don't touch the sun again, it's correct. Third panel, they touch the hat, another correct response. But the 4th time, they touch the sun again, which is an incorrect response because you're trying to keep in mind. So this is working memory because we're having to update what information have I touched, and I can't use order of images as a guide because we keep swapping around where everything is. So you're sort of updating and holding this in mind. Then on the left side, we have this game called working memory span, or what we call houses. We show kids pictures of houses. Sometimes there's 2 houses, sometimes there's 3 houses, sometimes there's 4 houses, and they have to label what's the animal in the house and the color in the house. For each one of them, the screen advances, the houses are now empty, and you are going to be asked what animal was in this house or what color was in this house, but you don't know which I'm going to ask about. So there's lots of distraction. You had to load a lot of information in mind, and only some of it's going to be useful. So we're interested in performance of those. What we're going to then do for each task is estimate a longitudinal confirmatory factor model. And if you're familiar with structural modeling, that will make sense. If you're not familiar with structural modeling, don't worry about it. The basic idea is every task is generating some items, and we need to make certain that the items for this task are sort of behaving similarly across time. We need to make certain that the measurement properties of these items is stable or constant across time. This is just sort of a statistical necessity. I'm not going to show the results of these because we'll get deep in the weeds about things that aren't that interesting. But suffice it to say, for all of our tasks, we demonstrate that the task exhibits measurement and variance. So the items are working in the same way. And we'll get some stability estimates, which is just how do kids do when they get the same task in the fall, the winter, and the spring. Then what we're going to do, and this is where things get interesting, is we're going to fit what's called a bifactor model to the same data. So previously, there's one latent variable that represents your performance on these items at a particular testing occasion, right? So in this latent variable, the circle represents your performance on these items at the fall occasion. And same with winter and same with spring. In the bifactor model, you fit a model that looks similar but slightly different. And the key idea here is that we have this common factor at the bottom. And the key idea here is that this is a latent variable that all of the items for the fall, winter, and spring, they all load onto it. What that means is that latent variable is going to represent the variance in your performance across time. It's what's stable, it's what you're bringing to the EF assessment in the fall and the winter and the spring. The time-specific latent variables are reliable variance that was sort of unique or peculiar to that particular assessment period, right? So we're going to be able to use the latent variables at the top and the bottom to get some sense of how much of what kids are doing in these tasks is consistent or trait-like, and how much of it is sort of fiddly because there was something going on in the fall, winter, or spring. I also just wanted to put a quick slide in here. This is just a simple sort of demonstration that kids are improving in their performance on these tasks across time. And there's nothing about the modeling that we're going to do that precludes that from happening, right? What I'm really focusing on is a variance partitioning model. We're not in any way suggesting that kids can't improve in performance over time. So when I talk about trait-like variance, I'm not talking about something that's sort of stable and unchanging. Kids are going to get better. They're in preschool. They've seen these tasks before. They should get better, and they do. Then we can look at, this is still from the longitudinal factor model, we can look at latent correlation. So these are the stability coefficients that I referenced. This is just showing you how strongly correlated is kids' performance on a task between the fall and the winter occasion, or between the winter and spring occasion. And what you take away from here is all of these tasks are pretty stable, right? In general, if you did better on arrows in the fall, you're going to do better on arrows in the winter and better in the spring. And if you look at the first column or the second column, you'll see that these things are really becoming more stable between the winter and the spring. Kids are really starting to we're really starting to get sort of strong rank order sort of differences in how well you're doing. The other thing is that our reference tasks, our comparisons tasks, which are bubbles, which is just a measure of reaction time, and assessor raters of attention using the PSRA that a number of you are, those are also really stable, right? So in general, the kids who look like they're really quick at thinking quickly in simple reaction time tasks, they look that way often, every time we see them. And when assessors are viewing kids as really engaged or really disengaged, that tends to be pretty stable. They tend to be the same kids. However, and I want to reiterate this, these stability correlations are not getting at what we want, which is how much of the variance is trait-like and how much of it is state-like. This is with 2 time points, or looking at correlations between 10 time points, you're conflating this. So here are the results, and this is busy, but I'm going to help you make sense of it. This is the result from the bifactor model. So here, what we're doing is we've partitioned the latent variant, the reliable variance in each task into these 2 components. You can just think about this as a simple ratio. So of the 100% of reliable variance, how much of it is trait-like, how much of it is state-like. And remember that the conventional assumption is that it should be all gray, it should be all consistent. We sit down and we administer tests on a single testing occasion, and we assume how you did today gives me something about who you are and what you're going to bring to this task all the time. That's, of course, an unreasonable assumption, but we make it all the time. So there's a couple things to draw from this. One is that in general, the EF tasks tend to be more consistent over time or more trait-like than the comparison measures. That's sort of interesting. And most of the variance in these comparison measures are, in fact, occasion specific. The factors that are sort of contributing to your being attentive or inattentive seem to be sort of not necessarily an attribute about you, which counters this, the strong stability coefficients. The other thing that's was a little bit interesting to us was, why are 2 of our tasks only 50% consistent and 50% occasion specific? What would be happening where these tasks are so susceptible to situational influences, right? So the animal go, no-go task is, you can think about this as 50% of the variance is attributable to traits, and the same thing with working memory span, where some of these other tasks, 89% or 86%. So we're thinking about this, and anyone who's worked with preschoolers will know, lots of preschoolers, when you tell them we're going to come play your fun games, they don't find your games fun for very long, right? And they will often tell you, I don't like your games, I don't want to do this anymore. Or if they won't tell you verbally, non-verbally, they're a lot more interested in things going on elsewhere, right? And we always train data collectors. We don't want missing data. Give kids a break, push on through. We want to get we want to get everyone to perform these tasks. But we realized when we looked at our data set that animal go, no-go and working memory span tended to be administered late in the assessment period. We weren't great in this study about systematically looking at the order of tasks. So it's a little bit messy. But what we do is we go back into the data set and we pull out the animal go, no-go data, and we say, create an early data set and a late data set. The early data set is when animal go, no-go was administered in the first half of the assessment. And then the late is the second half. And similarly, we would do that with working memory span. Then we refit our models, we refit the bifactor model, we recompute things, and the red arrows at the top show you what happens. So the apparent 50% consistency in animal go, no-go climbed up to 93% when that task is administered early in the assessment period. Right? It's a whopping difference. It suggests when you experience animal go, no-go early on and you're fresh, there's a lot of sort of trait-like contribution to that performance. When animal go, no tends to be at the end of the task, there's a lot more situational influence, which we think anecdotally is kids are just tuned out, right? They're playing along because the assessor's trying to get them to complete the task, but they've communicated one way or the other. I want to tap out here. And we see a similar phenomenon with the working memory span. So it goes from 50% up to 76%. But this is all post hoc. You know, I'm now cutting the data up in ways that maybe we shouldn't be. But it was interesting, and it provided some sort of clarity to us about what might be happening. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this Basically, all I did was represent the consistency, occasion specificity for our tasks using those early data for two of the tasks that were a little wonky. And I noted that there was a Nordic researcher who had done a similar sort of approach with undergraduates. And punchline is they come up with some estimates of consistency in their EF data with undergraduates that look a lot like we're seeing in our preschoolers, which is interesting. Again, there are limitations to this. I'm not going to walk through these in the interest of time. However, I do want to underscore, this is a convenient sample of preschoolers in Central North Carolina. I have no idea how this is going to generalize to kids of other ages and other places. I have no idea to what extent would this inform the work that you all are doing. But it would be really easy to imagine designing a study where you could interrogate some of this in places that you're working. So 3 main conclusions, 3 implications. EF tests are primarily indexing trait level influences. This is the good news, right? This is the assumption that we often make. Here's some empirical evidence to support that. You need 3 assessment periods to actually sort this out. So typically we're assuming it. You can actually empirically test it if you have 3 assessments. And test fatigue may be a situational influence that's sort of undermining preschoolers' performance on some of these tasks. So with those 3 conclusions, what I'd say is there's some things that this may sort of inform in terms of data collection. So as we're thinking about designing new studies, it suggests maybe we should think about multiple short assessments rather than one long assessment, right? In preschool settings, this is easy to do. It's easy for me to go into a preschool and say, I'm going to draw you for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to draw you for 15 minutes, and I'm going to draw you for 15 minutes, and tomorrow I'll come back and draw you again for 15, and you again for 15, and you again as opposed to, Brent, we're going to work for 45 minutes. And then Sarah, we're going to work for 45 minutes, right? Multiple short would create the opportunity for 3 assessments, and it keeps kids fresh. This is not easy to do if kids are coming to you in a clinic or coming a long distance. Second question that this raises is, should we discourage data collectors from encouraging kids to keep testing, keep working with us, right? Are they giving us data that's actually generating noise and is not a good reflection of their true ability? The problem, of course, is then we have missing data and we don't know what they would have done. So we're a bit in a pickle. But it does raise this question, and I've been thinking a lot about how often I tell data collectors, just give them a stretch break, ask them to talk about their pet, and then dive back in. And maybe that's a bad idea. The last thing is sort of an implication for modeling, which is if you have hypotheses like prenatal HIV exposure predicting EF, if you have 3 assessments, you can actually create a trait-like measure of EF and state-like measures of EF. And I think oftentimes our hypotheses are thinking about trait as the outcome, but we use performance on a single occasion that's conflating trait and state. So we might get sharper tests of our hypotheses if we were to sort of go through this effort and do 3 assessments. And then the last idea, of course, is if you're not interested in EF, substitute whatever it is you're interested in. If you're doing some sort of direct assessment with kids or thinking about direct measures of behavior, the same issues apply. To what extent is what you're getting some stable characteristic of this kid versus influenced by the situation? And so if you don't care about EF, there's still hopefully some merit in thinking about this for other things that you do. But I don't know how we're doing on time. Feels like we're doing okay. We have till 9:15. My email is there so that if we don't have time to get to your question or you prefer to talk separately, I'm happy to entertain emails. And I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A if there is anything you want us to go out.